You are listening to the Apex Hour hosted by Ryan Paul on KSUU Thunder 91.1. This show allows more personal time with our guests, allowing them to give us their stories and opinions. We will also give you new music to listen to, hoping you enjoy some new sounds and genres. Welcome to this episode of the Apex Hour.
Welcome to the Apex Radio Hour. I'm producer Kason Graff, and I'm joined today with Apex Director Ryan Paul and Executive Director of Realist Revolt, Ward Wilson. I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. We're excited to have Ward Wilson here, a thoughtful gentleman and scholar on nuclear weapons, and so we're going to have a great conversation. We're joined in the studio with my good friend and producer, Kason Graff, and our other student producers, Kate Scherer and Lauren Bird. So we're here with Ward Wilson, who has been speaking here at SUU as one of our Eccles Apex speakers. And what I'd like to do first is always ask a question about kind of how we get to now and what led you to do what you do.
Okay, so when I was 6 and just a little blonde-headed crew-cut kid wandering around New Jersey, something weird happened to my parents. I noticed that they weren't smiling or laughing. We were kind of a jokey household, and they seemed weird, and their jaws seemed really tight. I worried about it for a few days. I thought maybe there was a disease that, started off with locking your jaw and then you died. I eventually asked my mom, and she said, bad men, I'm using air quotes, bad men put missiles on an island 90 miles from the coast of the United States, and those missiles have bombs on them that could blow up everything, and they can come down out of the sky at any time. And she was talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was a really scary week. Somebody once called it the week when the world held its breath. I can remember standing in the front yard, this little kid with a heavy coat on, and it's a blustery fall day and gray clouds overhead, and I'm looking up, just looking up, for a long time. I was looking for the first speck of the missiles coming in. I don't know what I was going to do, run in and tell my mom, we're blown up. But it stuck with me, and after college, I somehow started thinking about nuclear weapons again, and then it wouldn't let me go. I tried to have a profession as a computer consultant for a while, but I eventually ended up back on nuclear weapons. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is not what you wanted to be when you grew up.
No. I was hoping to be, I don't know, maybe an actor or something where you could get a lot of attention. That was, when I was a little kid, that was my main goal in life.
So I think it's interesting that, as a historian, I think about this all the time, about the power of memory and how it leads us down certain paths. So you have this experience as a kid during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then, it wouldn't let you go, but it's not in the forefront of your mind, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes right out of your head. I don't think about it again until, 17 years later.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get to, is that what is that kind of eureka moment, or that moment that dials in where that memory comes back and you kind of shift courses?
Well, I went to we were living in Princeton, New Jersey, and I went to a church conference at at Nassau Presbyterian Church, it was called then. And it was about nuclear weapons, and it was an all-star lineup. The guy who negotiated SALT II was there, some physicists, and a woman named Helen Caldicott, who was an Australian doctor, and she did the most fabulous, emotive, catch you by the throat and not let go thing about how after a nuclear war there'd be no hospitals, the doctors would be all dead, and it was riveting, and that's when I got caught. That's when I got stuck, and there's a bunch of people, you meet people and they say, oh yeah, the person who got me was Helen Caldicott. So.
And then, I mean, you think about these things in a different way, right? When we think about generally anti-nuclear activists, we think of people marching in the streets and talking about Armageddon and destruction. And you've approached it a little different way.
So the first 2 years, I said, okay, nuclear weapons, there's got to be a way to get rid of them. Moral arguments are obviously immoral. So I'm going to come up with the best moral arguments, and that'll change everything. Bertrand Russell tried, but I'll show him how. And I can remember pacing around in my parents' living room trying to think about, what about, and I read books about just war theory. And it wasn't until about 2 years later into this long course of study and kind of thinking about it a lot that I realized that in a crisis, people will do immoral things. If your family's threatened and the only weapon you have to defend them is an immoral one, you'll probably use that weapon. And so in a nuclear crisis, moral arguments aren't necessarily going to hold you back. And in fact, my study of the Cuban Missile Crisis validated that, because Robert Kennedy made some moral arguments during the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the discussions about what they should do. And some people were moved by it, but a lot of them were just, we have to do whatever we have to do, whatever's necessary. And so I realized that moral arguments were good, they were important, but they weren't going to get you all the way there. And so I decided I had to think up realist arguments. I had to think up arguments about pragmatism and utility. And as far as I know, there weren't very many people doing that. And I never fit in really in the peace movement because they want to talk about morality. And I was always saying, well, are nuclear weapons really useful? So.
Yeah, I never fit in either because I never had enough hair to be long. So I think it's interesting because if you look at like nuclear weapons, the historiography of them and the idea of them in popular culture, generally when we get into this idea of what nuclear war is about, we're talking about things like Planet of the Apes, where we've blown up the world, The Day After, where it's about, well, we'll get to people talking about nuclear weapons by showing them what it will do to them, as opposed to what it does to other people. And that's not kind of where you went with your argument.
Yeah. Okay. I believe you. Say more.
Well, I'm just thinking that this idea of how do you motivate people to do things, right? There's the carrot and the stick, right? And so there's hope and there's fear. And what we have found over the course of history is generally fear motivates people. If I can get you to be afraid, I can be the solution to that fear, I can get you to let me do what I want.
Yeah, I would argue fear is a better irrational motivator, that as long as you don't think a lot, fear works powerfully. But for a lot of long-term work, you need hope. Hope is also a powerful motivator, and in some ways it's a different. So yeah, and I mean, it actually took me a long time. I thought there are people in the nuclear movement, in the anti-nuclear movement, who say, the problem is people are not afraid enough. We need to make them more afraid. And I just don't think that's so. I think the experience of the last 79 years shows that there have been some great, terrifying movies and experiences, but we're in the middle of a second nuclear arms race. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, is there an argument I can use that will not only appeal to people who are against nuclear weapons, but might kind of crack the armor of the people who are in favor of it? I wanted a down the middle. And actually, I had also been reading a lot of William James and Ludwig Wittgenstein, who are both kind of pragmatic, utilitarian folks, not in the philosophical utilitarianism, but kind of they're about what works in some ways. And so at one point it struck me that what I was trying to do was to figure out, did nuclear weapons work? Were they really useful? And if you could look at their use, you could understand what they were better than if you just looked at the mushroom cloud and felt afraid.
Surprisingly, this may surprise you to know this, but actually Kate's nickname on her high school volleyball team was Ludwig Lichtenstein.
It's true. It's very true.
Get out.
Yeah, imagine that. So you've talked about this idea of I mean, the organization that you created, it was called Realist Revolt. And you've talked about multiple times, and I encourage those of you who are listening to the podcast to visit the SU Apex website and actually watch his presentation. But can you define for us what realism is, right? You talk about, I want a realist argument. So what does that mean?
So there is a school in international relations called the Realist School, capital R, and it was founded by, what's his name at Chicago? Oh, God, I'm blanking on his name. And he actually took me out to lunch one time and warned me not to use realist as a word because it was his. But for me, I'm like a common sense, ordinary person realist. I take facts very seriously. I think that history is important. I think you have to accept the world as it is rather than trying to see it through a particular lens that of theory. I believe that, I believe everyone does things because they sing about it, and that's my lens, and so I see all history in that through that. So for me, realism is like small r realism. It's just, you care about facts. You want to take the world seriously and not imagine it different from the way it really is.
So kind of like the logic Vulcan approach to nuclear weapons.
Well, if we can live long and prosper, I'm
there
all
you go.
for that.
So your first book, which is essentially about the top 5 myths of nuclear weapons. What do we get wrong? I want to come back and we'll talk about after our first break the idea of realism and those kinds of things. But initially, when you approach someone to talk about how we rid the world of nuclear weapons, how we detach humankind from these big devices or small devices, but these almost mythological experiences.
Yeah.
How do you unravel that onion? What do we get wrong?
If nuclear weapons were a religion, Hiroshima would be the first miracle. They invent this thing, they explode it in the desert. It's awesome, huge cloud, fireball. They're awestruck. And then within a month, they've dropped one on Hiroshima, they've dropped another on Nagasaki, and the next day the Japanese say, yeah, we'll surrender. And the Japanese had been totally unwilling to give up, even though they had clearly lost the war months earlier. So suddenly this bomb appears to be able to get a Japanese leadership to surrender suddenly when they wouldn't, nothing else moved them. The blockade where they were cutting off food, the city bombing with fire bombs, the defeats for the Navy at sea, none of that seemed to matter. But then they dropped the bomb and it's like overnight. And so that's what people remember. So that to me is, if you're going to challenge a religion, you want to start with the first miracle.
So the first layer of this myth, the first myth we talk about in your mind is that the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan ended World War II.
Yep. And I can do a little of do you want me to say why I think it's a myth?
Sure. Let's talk about it.
So we know that the Japanese surrendered because the Soviet Union, which had been neutral, they signed a neutrality pact with Japan in 1941 that was going to run for 5 years until 1946. And we know that they surrendered because the Soviets broke that pact and came into the war because that's what they said they'd do. They had a meeting in June of 1945. They were kind of the Supreme Council, which was then the effective body that ran the government, wanted to kind of reassess the whole war effort and see where they were and discuss important issues. And when they talked about Russia, they said, if the Soviet Union comes into the war, we have to surrender. Kawabe Toroshiro, the deputy chief of staff of the army, said maintaining neutrality with the Soviet Union is imperative for the continuation of the war. So they said they couldn't keep going if the Russians came in. The Russians came in on the night of August 8th, 9th. The next day, they had a series of frantic meetings, including an emergency meeting of the Supreme Council. And by 2 o'clock the next morning, they had tearfully decided to surrender. So that's pretty clear cut.
I think it's important that you mention in your book and in our conversations that they discounted Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. It's like they knew that it had happened, and it's like, well, this is just another city bombing. And while they're meeting, in that 10 o'clock meeting on the 9th, they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, and they still are like, well, this doesn't change anything.
Yeah, and amazingly, they had some straw votes in the cabinet was meeting by that point. They'd started with the Supreme Council in the morning, then the cabinet. And the cabinet remained deadlocked even after news of Nagasaki came in. And Anami Karechika, who was the Minister of War, had gotten some information about an American pilot, a P-51, those are the long-range fighters, pilot who'd been shot down and captured and interrogated. And they had asked him about the nuclear weapon because Hiroshima had already happened. And he said, oh, yeah, we've got a lot of nuclear weapons. And they said, how many? He said, we have 100. And Tokyo's going to be the next target. He says they were torturing him. So, he was just making stuff up to amuse them. But Karechika, or Anami, goes into the meeting, and he turns to everyone sitting there and says, yes, they have more atomic bombs, and the next one is going to be dropped on Tokyo. And it doesn't change the vote at all. They're not moved.
And what I find fascinating about this is that, as you look at it culturally in America, right, that the war ends so soon after these bombs that obviously they're going to ascribe. It would make sense that people are saying, oh, this is it. We'd ended the war with Germany months earlier, and this, we want to be done with this. How many tens of thousands of American servicemen are getting ready to board the boat to the Pacific after fighting in Europe and in the European theater? But also, nobody in America at the time wants to give the win to the Soviets.
Russians. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right, to the communists.
Or in the 40s or in the 50s or in the 60s. So you don't get any historians going back and kind of revising the story because we're hating the Soviets then. So the reason myths survive because they align with prejudices or desires or patriotic notions that we already have. So, the Hiroshima myth works for the Americans because we're not really warriors. The Germans are kind of a warrior culture. They have a history of the berserkers, and they fought really hard and were probably the premier soldiers in World War II. But we're not that way. We win wars, but we're not, excited about being warriors as much. We're inventors. We've got Thomas Edison. We've got, guys Henry Ford. And so the bomb is perfect for us because we invented the magic weapon that won the war overnight. It proves how good we are at inventing things. It fits with our national ethos in a way. And so we welcomed it. We didn't want to look under the hood and see if it was real because it fit. It reinforced what we wanted to feel about ourselves.
So we see that as, so if we think about, and we'll talk again a little more about this, but we see that the dropping of the atomic bomb did not end World War II. We could argue that it might have hastened it a little bit or changed people's attitudes, but it doesn't. It's not that's the first pillar of nuclear weapons. So what are a couple of the other myths that we get wrong here?
Well, the next most important one, from my perspective, is the battlefield utility, the ultimate weapon thing. People talk about nuclear weapons and they call them the ultimate weapon. Like they're the best of any weapons, and there's never going to be any better weapon. So essentially, the evolution of weapons has stopped because now we've invented this weapon. Nothing will ever change that. The fact is, the utility of a tool depends on the match between its characteristics and the situation at hand. And weapons are essentially tools for doing violence. And so if you want to paint a barn, you do not want to use a flathead screwdriver. You want to use a paintbrush. If you want to shoot something underwater, you want to use a spear gun. You don't want to use a howitzer, because if the shells get wet, they won't go off, and maybe it depends on the circumstances what makes a weapon useful. And so the question isn't, are nuclear weapons the biggest bombs ever? The question is, are there circumstances where using the biggest bomb ever is going to match your needs? If you look at the battlefield, you see right away that there's a problem with this being in love with bigness. The average frontline soldiers, they're about a third of a mile to a few yards apart. A 10 kiloton battlefield, I'm using air quotes again, nuclear weapon, which is about 2/3 the size of the Hiroshima bomb, has an area of severe effects that's about a mile across, a circle of about a mile, and then diminishing effects out to about 5 miles. So if you use that bomb on the frontline troops of your adversary that are a third of the mile from your troops, you're going to kill some of your own troops. You effectively cannot use battlefield nuclear weapons on the front line. Well, so what else is there in the battlefield? Well, maybe you could use them behind the line. But then, again, there's another problem, which is nuclear weapons give off radiation. And radiation goes wherever the wind blows it. It's not under your control. There's not a dial you can turn to say, make all the radiation go to the right. So you drop that same 10 kiloton bomb, and the radiation can go lethal radiation can go 25 miles in an hour. And fallout can go hundreds of miles farther. Less severe fallout can go hundreds of miles farther. So how are you going to use a weapon like that that's too big, it's blundering, it leaves all this radiation everywhere, you can't control where the radiation goes? Are you going to wait till the wind changes in the right direction before you launch the attack? How are you going to tell your troops that are nearby that they have to pull back and cover up and get under? I mean, the logistics of it are so complicated that in a fast-moving battle, you basically cannot figure out how to use nuclear weapons.
Well, I think you've also talked about this idea that if we look at the movement of weapons development, we're not going bigger. We're going smaller, more easily deliverable, more accurate. Yeah. Accuracy is what we're looking for, because we don't want to kill our own people.
Right. The whole trend in war is away from big blundering weapons and towards smarter, smaller, more precise weapons, more discriminate weapons. And nuclear weapons increasingly seem like dinosaurs, too big to survive.
Yeah. All right, let's take our first break as we move forward. Those of you who've listened to us before know that we ask our guests to give us a list of songs that mean something to them, and Ward Wilson has done that. So the first song I want to play is a song you gave us called "Other Side of the World" by Laura Shea. Can you tell us why you chose this song?
I just love it. It feels like setting out. It feels like excitement. It feels like when she sings it, she talks about how she has the heart of a lion. She's ready to go out and conquer the world. And I think if you're going to try to do something about nuclear weapons, you better have some upbeat music to go with it.
There you go. All right, this is Other Side of the World by Laura Shea. Bring!
All right, that was Other Side of the World by Laura Shea. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSUU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
We're here with Ward Wilson. He's been on campus talking about nuclear weapons. We left off with talking about myths of nuclear weapons. And I have a question that I think is, and you've brought it up and we've kind of discussed this, is that the world, I mean, nuclear weapons, obviously one of the arguments we make against them is that, battlefield nukes essentially harm, kill, maim your own people as well as destroy the enemy. Well, so do biological weapons. Mm-hmm. And we have seen that certainly in World War I, these kinds of really horrific weapons, the pre-nukes of their day, if you will. Mm-hmm. And yet we have banned biological weapons.
Yep.
So why are we having a problem with this?
Well, good question. So chemical weapons were used extensively in World War I. They were initially banned in 1925. They were not used significantly in World War II. The Germans didn't use them at all. The Japanese used them a little in China. But by and large, they weren't as big. And then in the, I think, 90s, there was a worldwide ban, and everyone said, yeah, we got to ban chemical weapons. So that's an interesting data point, because chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons are called weapons of mass destruction too. So why is this one weapon of mass destruction getting banned and this other one is like the most important weapon and people want them and Kim Jong-un builds them and makes his people starve in order to get them? And then biological weapons were developed and not really used in war, at least not to the extent of chemical weapons. But then they were banned in like 2 years. 1972 to 1974, they did the negotiations. They negotiated the whole thing. Everyone signed on pretty much. And treaty's been running fine for 40 years, no real violations. And yet, so here are these two weapons of mass destruction that we've pretty happily banned. And then this other one where we talk about it as being essential. It's necessary for us to survive. It's the and so what's the difference? What's the difference between these two classes of weapons? And I would argue, as a practical matter, there's not much difference. Nuclear weapons are too big to really use on the battlefield. They're suicidal to use in a long-range war where you fire missiles back and forth between the two homelands. So why do we hold on to nuclear weapons with this kind of death grip? And we're perfectly happy to take biological weapons and say, forget it. And I think the answer is that somehow, well, partly it's the Hiroshima thing, but the people at the first test of nuclear weapons were so awestruck, and they used all this biblical language to describe what they saw. They didn't say it was a bright flash of light and then there was a large column of smoke. They said it was like a vision from the book of Revelation, so awesome that we felt terrified for messing with the powers that had hitherto been reserved to the Almighty. It's remarkable how often, as you read the descriptions of what people said after the first test, they make references to the Bible. And in fact, the test itself was named Trinity, in an obvious reference to the Bible. So I think what happened is, and then of course, we used them in Japan and the Japanese surrendered right away. And so it seemed as if the weapons were these awesome, godlike, powerful things that not only could they win a war in 4 days, but somehow magically they could give us that godlike power, or at least that was the kind of seductive myth that grew up around them. And then I think then we were off to the races. Once you get that myth out there that there are these one weapons that give you godlike power, can win a war in 4 days, now suddenly they seem enormously desirable, and no one wants to take a close look, try to figure out if objectively this is really the case.
Well, I think it's interesting that we talk about Armageddon and the apocalypse, which is essentially the end of the New Testament, and biological weapons are obviously in reference to, in some ways, the plagues of Moses against Egypt in the Old Testament, right? So this is these two different kinds of things. And I remember, as we were justifying going into the Gulf War or to Afghanistan and Iraq later, is that this idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction,
right?
And no one was distinguishing what that meant. The average person thought, Saddam Hussein is developing nuclear weapons,
right?
When in reality we're talking about chemical weapons.
Yep.
And I think that was a very kind of, there was a misleading in some ways of getting people to say, well, we don't want the Iraqis to have nuclear weapons.
But that's exactly what mythology does. It kind of smudges all the facts. You lose track of the distinctions because you're caught up in the emotion of the myth. And so, yeah, I agree.
So I think it's interesting that, and we've had this conversation over the days while you're here, but in 1953, when Eisenhower gets elected, as he gets inaugurated, it's right about the same time Joseph Stalin dies, and Eisenhower gives a speech to the National Press Club. It's called the Chancellor's Peace Speech, where here's this guy who was opposed to the dropping of the atomic bomb, a president, a warrior, a military guy since he was young. And he gives this speech to America and to the Russians saying, your leader's dead, now let's think about how we can do this. And he talks about the costs of nuclear weapons. And not just in the costs of economics, right? For every plane that we build could be a school or a neighborhood. But there's this great paragraph where he talks about that if we focus on weapons development, think about what we're losing. All those minds are not thinking about ways to feed people and to cure disease and everything else. So I'm interested in your thoughts of what the hidden costs of nuclear weapons are. Like, what do we lose? We get the idea of weapons in the terms of destruction, but what are we also giving up?
Well, from 1945 until, I don't know, the middle 90s, we spent $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons, and those are 1950s and 60s dollars. So, we spent a lot of money. And I don't know what the statistics are off the top of my head, but imagine how many hospitals that builds. Imagine how many extra post offices that builds. Imagine how much more quickly you could bring electricity to, distant villages, or I don't know. You could do Head Start for young children. If you focus on war, if you channel all your resources into war, you tend to get a lot of industries that build stuff for war, and you don't unleash the full creativity of the society because we're all busy trying to think of a better way to build a hydrogen bomb, or not all of us, but I'm saying, you waste some of that energy and creative talent that could be used to do research on the psychology of human beings so that we could all learn to be better people. There are ways that we could improve the quality of our lives if we weren't so busy practicing jumping under desks and hiding from nuclear attacks.
So we're having this discussion in Utah right now about nuclear power. So what is your thought on harnessing the atom, not for a bomb, but for nuclear power?
So I'm agnostic on nuclear power. I know a bunch of physicists. I used to have a good connection with the physics department at Princeton, and I met a bunch of people and some, and some of them say that nuclear power is a nightmare. It can never be safe. And it's true that plutonium and uranium are really tough to keep, control of. The radiation can spread really easily. And some of them say you take adequate safeguards, you build it right, it's a boon for the society. We're coming into a time when we have problems with global warming, so what we need more energy that's clean, and nuclear is clean energy, they say. And basically, I don't know. I'm not a physicist, I'm a historian. So I'm not sure. I know that a lot of people don't like nuclear power or nuclear weapons, in part because of radiation. Radiation has a weird kind of magical feeling to it because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, taste it. It's invisible, and that's kind of scary for people. And I've heard people say irrational things like, if we have a war and we bomb a city with a nuclear weapon, it will never recover. And it's certainly true that after the meltdown of the reactor in Russia, parts of that remain irradiated to this day. But I took the train through Hiroshima, and about 10 years ago, it's a thriving city. They blasted it and it came back. So I don't know where I was going with that. So it seems to me that nuclear power, I just don't know. I'm against nuclear weapons. I'm sure they're going to kill a lot of people. Nuclear power? And actually, to be completely frank, I don't want to take a position on nuclear power, besides the fact that I don't know whether it's really okay or not, in part because I want the South Africans on board and I want Kazakhstan on board. There are countries that do a lot of nuclear power but are against nuclear weapons. And if you want to be against everything nuclear across the board, you don't get to make them into allies. And I think it's so important to get rid of nuclear weapons that I think we should be friends with the people in Kazakhstan, encourage the people in South Africa who want to get rid of nuclear weapons. In fact, in South Africa, let's just point this out. People always say there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. In fact, there were 10 because the South Africans built nuclear weapons in secret. Then they kept them for, 10 years. And then they thought about it and they said, and they threw them away. So when you imagine that everyone wants nuclear weapons and they'll do anything to get them, it's worth remembering the South Africans because for some reason they didn't, and actually I met de Klerk, the president of South Africa, when they got rid of the nuclear weapons, and I asked him about it. And he said, well, we just couldn't see any reason for them. They just weren't going to be that useful to us.
Utility.
Yeah.
All right, let's take our second break. This is a song, and I'm glad that you chose this, actually, because it's an amazing composer and film. So this is from a song from the Coen Brothers remake of the John Wayne classic True Grit. The music is composed by Carter Burwell, and the section that you chose is River Crossing. So why did you choose this?
It's the same. You listen to this music, you want to get up on your pony and ride across that river and go. It's fun. It always lifts me up and makes me want to run harder, lift more weights.
Okay, this is River Crossing by Carter Burwell from the Coen Brothers remake of True Grit. Bring.
All right, that was River Crossing by Carter Burwell, part of the True Grit soundtrack. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. So we've been talking about a variety of topics specifically related to nuclear weapons. So as we move towards our last section of the show, what is the process? Like in your mind, we think about, in my mind, I see the images of the aircraft carriers after Vietnam dumping all the helicopters over into the ocean, and all that kind of stuff. So what's the process? What would the process look like to get rid of nuclear weapons?
So let me complain about NGOs first. There's a ton of NGOs that work on nuclear weapons. And
you should define what NGO means for those that are
non-government organization. They're essentially, people who are trying to do something in the public interest, and they're generally nonprofits. But they're interested in national policy. And what they do, which seems sensible, is they try to persuade policymakers to have better policies. But nuclear weapons are such a closed world. It's a very heavily theory. There's a lot of jargon. It's almost like its own language. And it's really hard for outsiders to have any impact. And so what happens is that you go to Washington, you start to talk to these policy people. They'll only listen to you if you talk to them using their concepts, their jargon, their point of view, kind of. And you do that for a year or two, and pretty soon you're thinking about nuclear weapons the way they do, rather than changing the way they think about nuclear weapons. And so I'm convinced that trying to change nuclear weapons policy by focusing on the policymakers, this elite group of probably less than 2,000 people that fundamentally shape how, and they have their own language and theory and beliefs, and I don't think you can ever do that. They spent their whole careers locked into this this mindset about nuclear weapons. So the first step to me is go talk to ordinary people. You don't have to be an expert to have an opinion about nuclear weapons. You don't have to know how a car engine works in order to have a legitimate opinion about what the speed limit should be on your street. Same is true of nuclear weapons. You don't have to know how an explosion works. That's nonsense. You don't have to be a physicist. All you have to know is a little bit about human nature and think about where you want the United States of America to go and if you want it to survive, and those kinds of questions, things that all of us can think about. So the first thing I think is that what we need is a nuclear weapons debate at the grassroots level, at the local level. And if you can get people to see that nuclear weapons aren't very useful, and if you can dispel some of the mythology that they give us godlike power, then you might start to have something. The thing I think of in my mind, because I'm a historian, is Prohibition in the 20s. Prohibition started in towns. Two little towns next to each other would have a little thing, and they'd vote, some resolution about we're against alcohol, blah, blah, blah. And then another bigger town nearby would vote again, and then they'd get a city nearby to vote, and then the whole state would vote. And it was a whole process, an organic process that grew from the ground up. And that's what I think in terms of getting U.S. policy to change. Once you have enough political pressure so that you can change votes, you can decide who gets elected in Congress or not. And a lot of congressional elections are not, the margin of victory is not that great. You persuade 5,000 people in a district and you might be able to convince someone to pay attention to what you say. So you start at the grassroots, and what you're talking about is you're not saying we should lay down our weapons and then the other side will be so impressed with our nobility that they'll become good and kind and trusting people like us. I mean, that's silly. That is not realistic. The way the Biological Weapons Treaty works is that everybody signed it, they all got rid of their biological weapons together, simultaneously. So that's what you've got to be, that your goal has to be a treaty like the Biological Weapons Convention. Everybody signs it together. You don't have to get rid of any of your weapons beforehand. Like the U.S. could hold on to all its nuclear weapons until the treaty's signed, and then we get rid of them. You don't have to, I'll get rid of 6, and then if that inspires you, you'll get rid of 6. So you start at the grassroots. You have a plan that doesn't call for getting rid of weapons before you have a final agreement. You get the final agreement. And what do you need in order to get the final agreement? What you need is to get rid of that myth. Because let's face it, as long as these weapons give us godlike power, nobody's going to ever want to give them up. Who would say, yeah, take away my godlike power? I mean, Samson did. No, but even he wanted it back for a minute so he could pull the temple down. I don't know enough of my Bible to know if that really applies. But nobody wants to give up godlike power. That's not human nature. So as long as nuclear weapons are seen as having this supernatural, weirdly powerful quality, then you can't get rid of them. So the first step is to convince people to look at the reality, to examine it objectively, to see that, as a matter of fact, the weapons don't have that much utility. And deterrence will eventually fail because human beings are flawed. We'll make a mistake someday. So if you have a piece of technology that's not very useful and it's pretty dangerous, like, Ryan, let's imagine I came to your house, knock on the door. You answer the door, and I say, Ryan, I want to sell you a stove. It's the latest technology. All your neighbors have it. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them have it. It's really expensive, but it'll be worth it because it is the latest stuff, and it's really prestigious. Everyone will admire you if you have this stove. And it's really expensive. Do you want to buy one? And you, because you're smart, say, no, no, why don't you come back, Ward? And because I'm a bad salesman, I let you off the hook and say, okay, I'll come back tomorrow. And then you go to your computer and you start, searching online, and you find out that, in fact, the stove, there's a lot of people complaining because the stove doesn't even boil water very well. And then there's another website that has been suppressed by the people that make the stove. And it turns out sometimes the stove spontaneously ignites and explodes. There was a family whose house burned down in St. Louis. They were all killed. So the question is, would you buy that stove? And once you tell all your neighbors about the facts, would they keep those stoves? No, because no one keeps technology that's not very useful and very dangerous. So if we can convince people that the objective reality is that nuclear weapons are not very useful and very dangerous, and both of those things are true, then it's really easy to convince people to get rid of them because it's a straight utility argument. It's not morality. It's not international politics. It's nothing fancy. It's just, why would you keep a tool that's a lousy tool?
Well, we can even argue that it's not even dangerous. It's like your cell phone. How many people want to trade up to the next cell phone? Because it's not that it's not dangerous. It's just that the technology is no longer useful.
Right.
I know a handful of people who have a VCR. I'm one of them. I don't use it regularly, but it's there, right? But we abandon technologies that no longer are useful to us.
There are no armies that equip their soldiers with blunderbusses. They just don't. They don't have triremes. There are no navies where they row with the oars and they're slapping the slaves with whips on the back and faster, because there's better stuff to use. And if nuclear weapons are too big and too clumsy and too much poison, and you have these tiny discrete things that are, more accurate, then why would you want to keep nuclear weapons? And it just becomes a utility question. It's a pragmatic thing.
Well, and we also have to peel that, I would think, away from politics, right? Like ultimately, grassroots needs to work because people of different political persuasions generally will work to see this as a human benefit.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we see, Johnson and Goldwater, right? The one commercial that ties nuclear weapons to politics. And once we kind of peel that back and realize that nuclear weapons isn't a political issue, it's a human one, we might be able to make some headway.
Nuclear weapons are not a test of your manliness. You're not a man if you have a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons are tools, and we either use them because they're useful or we don't. And all that other stuff is fluff. The cultural connections, the aesthetic stuff, that's not important. The mythology, There's a guy, how much time do we have?
You're good, keep going.
There's a guy who I sometimes debated with in the UK, and he would always say this thing, the reputation of nuclear weapons already exists, so we have to keep them in order to continue to maintain the reputation. And I would always say, whenever I think about reputation, I think about Patroclus. Patroclus was Achilles' best friend. I don't know if you remember your Iliad, but Achilles had a girl, and Agamemnon stole her away because he was mad about something. And Achilles went into a big sulk, and he says, I'm not going to fight. And, of course, the Achaeans, the side that Achilles is on, he's their best fighter, and now that he's not fighting, they're losing, they're getting pushed back, the Trojans are killing them, and there's a lot of blood in the sand and everything. And so guys keep coming to Achilles' tent and saying, hey, dude, or whatever the ancient Greek equivalent of dude is, you got to come fight because we're getting killed out here. And Achilles, he's a sulker. He says, I won't fight. They took my girl. So finally, Patroclus, his best friend, comes to him and says, okay, I understand you're upset. but here's the thing. Can I borrow your suit of armor? And Achilles says, oh, okay. So he takes the breastplate, the famous breastplate, and the giant shield, and he puts on the helmet. And he goes out, and he's back on the battlefield, and the Trojans look, and they see Achilles coming back onto the battlefield, and they fall back. And the Achaeans push forward, and they're cheering because now they're winning again. But Hector, one of the lead Trojans, says, I don't care, Achilles or not, I've got to fight him. His wife is saying, don't go. He says, I have to go. So he goes out, and he's fighting with Patroclus dressed as Achilles. And Apollo sneaks up behind Patroclus and knocks him down. He doesn't hurt him, but when he falls, his helmet comes off. And the Trojans look down and they see it's not the great Achilles, and they run him through with spears and kill him. And the point of the story is, I don't want a suit of armor protecting my country. I don't want just a reputation protecting the United States of America. I want the real Achilles fighting for us. Because if you're just using a reputation to protect yourself, anything could go wrong. A reputation can evaporate in a minute. And so I think nuclear weapons are 3/4 reputation, in my opinion. So I think we need to look at the practical realities if we want our country to be safe.
That's a pretty amazing way to kind of move into our final break and then into our last segment. So thank you, Ward. So this third song you chose is called The Rising of the Moon, and it's by the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. Can you tell us why you chose this?
I don't know. It's a little bit, I don't know, it just moves me. It's about an Irish rising where they're getting ready to try and get together and rise up and win their independence. So again, it's a kind of a struggle song.
Okay. The Rising of the Moon by Peter, Paul, and Mary. Bring!
That was The Rising of the Moon by Peter, Paul, and Mary. You listen to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. We're in the last part of our show here. If you've listened to us before, this is a segment that we talk about what's bringing us joy. Grateful for Ward Wilson here in our conversation. And again, please reference his Apex show. It'll be up in a week or so on the Apex website. So let's go ahead and get started. Ward Wilson, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
So I'm going to bend the rules. You'll be shocked to know. And I'm going to say that one of the things that's bringing me joy right now is we went up on the tower at the building where the Shakespeare Festival is.
The Engelstad Theater.
And stood on a high place and looked out over vast landscapes of mountains and clouds and red rock. And I just love big landscapes. I've traveled across the country, and big landscapes I associate with America. It makes me think of summer trips we took with my mom. I just love it. That makes me joyful.
Okay. Kate Scherer, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
I have been paying more attention to and getting more into the spy action film genre in anticipation for the next Mission Impossible. And last night I watched Austin Powers, and though not the best spy action movies, they're pretty silly humor and bring me a great amount of joy. So
you'll be happy to know, and this may surprise you to know, that I do my own stunts.
Oh, yeah?
I do.
It's pretty impressive.
All right, Lauren Bird, what are you currently watching, reading, playing, or listening to that is bringing you joy?
So I've been listening to a book called A Tale of Light and Shadow, which has been on my bookshelf for a really long time, but I am just barely getting around to it. And it has like fairy tale vibes and feels a lot like The Princess Bride, which is one of my favorite movies, so I've been really enjoying it.
Have you read The Princess Bride book?
I have not.
And how appropriate, since my presentation today was called The Shadow and the Light. So it's like all coming
Exactly.
together.
Brown noser. All right. Case and Graph, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
I am. Turn that down a little. I'm currently reading. I started it last night because I've been looking for an excuse for a while, and our talk at lunch on Tuesday finally gave me that excuse. Les Miserables. I started reading it, and I've never read it before. I'm surprised I've never read it before because I'm a French major. That's kind of an important book. But I'm reading it in English because my French is not good enough. My English, I'm not sure, is good enough. But I'm really enjoying it so far.
Have you heard the people sing?
That's actually one of the things I'm going to play a little later. Spoiler alert.
And how many pages is it?
I was going to grab it and check, but I left it in my bag in the hall, and it's not actually in the booth with me. I don't know off the top
More
of my
than
head.
1,000, probably.
I don't know.
Are you reading the unabridged version?
I'm reading whatever the fancy one I got at Barnes & Noble was.
Or maybe you'll find out why it's called Les Miserables.
Les Miserables. All right, Ryan, what are you watching, reading, listening to, or playing that's bringing you joy?
I have some friends, as you know. Well, it may come as a shock that I have friends, but that every once a month we go over to their house and we have a little board game night. This is a game that we just recently brought to the table. It's called Half Truths, designed by Ken Jennings, the Jeopardy guy, and essentially every card has a category with 6 options, 3 of which are true, 3 of which are not. And then you have to blindly kind of guess and figure out which it is, and you get points based on how many you get. And it really, without fail, proves to me how smart I really am not at these categories. So we were just talking on the break that one of the categories last time was biblical characters that committed suicide. And it had 6 choices, and you had to choose 3 of them. And there have been some really challenging questions. But that, with those friends, has brought me great joy. And with that, we'll wrap up our Apex Radio Hour with our 4th song. But before I ask you what that is, I do want to thank you,
Thank you
for being here and for Ward to tell us these things, really important and necessary messages. Please look at his Apex work. Please look at the Realist Revolt website and maybe pick up his books and really some thoughtful ideas about how we can legitimately change the world. So the 4th song you've chosen, that we've chosen here, is Walk Beside Me by Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott. Can you tell us why you chose this one?
Well, for one thing, I'm just fascinated by a guy who decides to write a song with 2 mandolins as the only instruments being played. A folk song. I don't know. I just like the message is kind of like we travel through life. We should walk side by side together. That'll make it better. It's kind of a companionship, friendship, love thing. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ward Wilson, for being here. Thank you all for listening to the Apex Radio Hour. We'll see you next week. And in the words of the great American poet Bill Withers, I wish you well. And this is Walk Beside Me by Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott. Bring!